it's wonderful that you share your journey and how you've come to where you are and able to birth what you offer. One thing that came up in reflecting on today and just thinking about this was how I know you are so committed to your practice. You and your wife, Sarah, are just, I love this example you give about you set your year out based on when you're going to be on retreat. And I know that you just emerged yourself from a 45-day Vipassana retreat, I believe, which is beautiful in and of itself. One of the guests was asking earlier, how does somebody who doesn't have 45 days to go on a Vipassana retreat because of their life circumstances or tolerance or appetite or whatever it might be, how do we start small, or how do we use small snippets of practice? And this is really a question for both of you. How do we adapt to what we can commit to and what we can do for our own healing in whatever type of role or life circumstances we find ourselves in?
I think that's something that it's really personal, right? We have to sort of take a good look at what our capacity level is, like not just in our life and the different responsibilities that we have, but we also have to take into account our own conditioning, our own trauma, and finding sort of that sweet spot where it's something that is challenging, but at the same time not overwhelming. You don't want to bring up so many things that then you run away from the inward process. You no longer want to reflect or get to know yourself because you are horrified by what's inside of you. But you want to find that sweet spot so that you can continue taking sustainable steps inward and start doing that liberational work. And I think it's beautiful. I mean, Jack was just talking about Cloud Sangha. That sounds something that it sounds very accessible. And there's so many different entry points that are available into your own internal landscape now. And it's not just about being able to do a 45-day course or a 10-day meditation course. If you can, I highly advise that you go do it. But if you can't, totally reasonable, and you can still find different techniques and practices that can help you start developing your equanimity, start developing your sense of awareness, and developing your compassion. And that's what's important, is if you do what you can, then we're all better off, including yourself. So,
And Jack?
Thank you, Diego. That's beautiful, and we are all better off. It's like Thich Nhat Hanh's expression where he said, when the crowded Vietnamese refugee boats met with storms or pirates, if everyone panicked, all would be lost. But if even one person on the boat remained steady and calm, it was enough. It showed the way for everyone to survive. And then you say, well, who's that person? And as Miss Piggy would say, moi. It turns out that you can be that person, or you become that person. So here's a few things to add to what you said so beautifully, Diego. One is you can start small, as you said, and I'll give you an example of really small, because Mang, our dear friend who helped start Search Inside Yourself Leadership, did a teaching for people in Ukraine last week, just before I did. And there's so much trauma, and it's so hard for people to close your eyes and go in your body. It's just carrying so much. He taught micro meditations. 1 mindful breath. How is that? 3 mindful breaths. Or if you can't sit because you're carrying the grief or something difficult in your life, do walking meditation practice. There are very simple, steady and grounding things, and in a minute, the neuroscience, Richie was here, Richie Davidson, in even 60 seconds, you start to re-regulate your nervous system, and you also come to a place where you can see with greater clarity. So there's that. One is making it simple. The second is the incredible need for community. We're such an individualistic nation, and the idea that you're supposed to meditate on your own, if you can have sex on your own too, it's all right. But it's kind of better with other people for the most part, And we really need community, whether it is a meditation buddy who you set your alarm and sit with every day or 3 times a week, whether it's Cloud Sangha or some other thing where you join, we actually, and traditionally where it's taught, wherever two or more are gathered in his name, whether it's satsang or sangha or minyan, or we need to support each other. Because, and in our culture, our speedy consumer, look at your calendar culture, we need each other. And so that becomes something that you can somehow build into in a deep way to help you sustain your practice.
We are in this time where we have all these channels available to us. And Jack, I've heard you speak of this recently, this kind of duality of existence we live within. We can, be flipping across the TV channels or our social feeds and checking out the latest gossip from the Grammys, and then within seconds we're witnessing the horrors of what is happening around the world. And I know you work with audiences and people, communities, and companies, many of whom are represented in this room, but you also offer practice groups in Ukraine right now. And I'm wondering if you can help us together, whether it's individually or in community, reconcile this duality that's in us all. How do we endure, whether it's with our practice or other ways of living, this difficulty of such different human experiences that are in our day-to-day exposure?
So first, Cecily, I just want to take your question in both personally, but for all of us, because we're actually carrying this in our hearts if we get quiet and pay attention, and it's a really deep one. And you use the word endure in your question, which is interesting and in a way kind of compelling, because what we're talking about is the human condition. Plato said only the dead know the end of war. Let that sink in for a minute. And part of the problem with Ukraine, and we'll get back to that in a minute, is not just what's happening in Ukraine, but that it's pushed aside what's happening in Myanmar or in Ethiopia and in Tigray or Libya or the Darfur camps. I'll talk about that in a minute. But your question is, how can we hold this in the human heart while we also can go to Whole Foods and decide, do I want the French cheese or do I want the Italian cheese, and so forth, and we have our prosperity. And I don't have a simple answer, because there isn't one. I think to be a human being means we have to carry the unbearable beauty of the world, that in the 45 minutes we'll be talking, there will be a billion acts of kindness, of parents making scrambled eggs or boiled rice for their children, and people helping someone down the stairs or across the street, and there'll be acts of violence. So there's this unbearable beauty and the notion of tears. And I think what's important for us is to be able to get quiet enough to not turn our gaze away from what's difficult, because we can get lost, as Diego and you were talking about, we can sort of get into the consumer thing because it's too hard to bear. And one of the beautiful things about meditation is that you become the Buddha, or you become the wise one who sits under your tree of enlightenment, and you begin to trust that you have the great heart of compassion in you, that you can hold all this. And it doesn't help to be depressed. I mean, there's a beautiful book with Tutu and the Dalai Lama, the Book of Joy, and how when you've seen so much suffering in South Africa and Tibet, and Dalai Lama said, so much has been taken from me, taken the monasteries, burned our texts, imprisoned the monks and nuns. Why should I let them take my happiness? It's a miracle to be alive, to have life, to watch spring come back. And if you go to a refugee camp, they don't want you to be depressed. Okay, I feel so sorry for you. They're depressed enough, They actually want someone to come in and say, as I have in talking to people, whether it's Ukraine or elsewhere, there are thousands of generations of your ancestors that have lived through difficulty, and you know how to do this. It's in your bones, it's in your DNA. Not only will you survive, but here's the important part. This is the time for your moral leadership. This is the time when your values get tested and whether you can do this. Because I have friends, this famous nonviolent wonderful person who called and said, I'm ready to sell what I have and buy missiles for the Ukrainians, right? And I said to her, I said, after a life of nonviolence, I said, here's my problem, dear. I said that in those tanks are young Russian guys, young Russian kids. In those armored vehicles from Russia are also young people. And how can you want to kill any of them? So that's the place to start. And then, since I'm on a roll for a minute, forgive me, we have a collective responsibility, all right? The USA is a warlike nation. We've had one war after another, and I can't tell you, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was this huge depression that swept over the Pentagon because we didn't have a good enemy to get all that money. You think I'm kidding? This is literal, and it's true. Now we've got a good enemy again. It's all we defunded the State Department. Benjamin Rush, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, wanted a defense or war department and a peacemaking department. Never been funded. We put $1 trillion into weapons. We sell them all around the world, and then we don't feel safe. There has to be So there has to be a different vision, and we who gather with this in the center of the technological world have to be willing to step back, because it's not about Ukraine or Russia, and there's lots of propaganda on both sides. Just be aware of this. I feel terrible for the people of Ukraine, nothing but that. But believe me, there is spin everywhere, from the oil companies to there's just lots going on, and it's easy to get swept away by the media, and it looks like a video game. Okay, who's right, and how do we win this one? In war, there is no one who wins. That's the truth of it. So when I talk to people in those circumstances, I really talk about stepping back. Yes, you need to find your moral center, because this is where you will be tested and where the new world will get born of something good. But at the same time, we also, as citizens, have to step back and say, what are we devoting ourselves to as a country and as a people? And this, then, can we use our technology to support in a beneficial way? Or do we do, the phrase that came was business as usual. And there's something literal about that, so.
Thank you.
I wanted to, a story popped up listening to Jack. My wife and I were talking the other day, and a friend of ours, someone really close to us, was saying that, they don't know if they want to have children because the world is so chaotic and it's in such a terrible time. And then I started thinking to myself, because one of my personal passions is history, was like, I asked my wife, I was like, when would be a good time? And I started just naming years, like 1968? It's like, no. I was like, 1930? No. 1890? I was like, no. 1840? Even worse. Like, you just keep going back, and there's always something horrific happening. There's something terrible. But human history is not just the history of suffering, it's also the history of victory, right? There are moments where we can be kind, but there's something quite special that's happening right now, which is that there is so much dharma, there is so much opportunity for healing, and it's becoming more and more accessible. And not just in the United States, but throughout the world, it's becoming more and more accessible. And that's sort of, it feels auspicious. It feels like it's not an accident. Why is it that at a time when there are so many historic, critical challenges that are right in front of us, that humans have to overcome for us to create a better world, it's the same time when the most healing is available probably ever in history. And I think that's something that I always turn to, and it gives me a lot of hope, because as we heal ourselves as individuals and as groups and as collectives, we become much more creative, much more compassionate. Our minds literally work better. We can come up with new solutions. And we're seeing that more and more, and I think it just gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah.